G'day Australia, welcome to the DIY-cademy. We put a lot of plug and play packs together for you to help it make it easy and fast and professional for you to DIY car audio upgrades at home in Aussie vehicles. However, there are some times that you will need to solder. While most of our packs are plug and play, there's some circumstances or some packs that require a couple of soldered connections. We're going to go over the tools and methods that we use to solder in store today to help give you a bit of a guide and to help new technicians and people working at home for the first time to understand the importance of soldering and the best ways to get it done. There's two major ways that we like to solder in the Audiocom stores and through our experience with the DIY-cademy for Univeralfuze.com. They are as follows. We either solder with a conventional soldering iron or with an open flame brazing style solder. There's advantages, pros and cons to each. We'll go over those shortly. The other important thing to understand is how to insulate after you've soldered. There's two major ways to do that. Number one, and the preferred way is with heat shrink insulation, which slides over the solder joint. We'll go into that shortly. That's the preferred and primary way of insulating, but it doesn't always work out depending on the application and the circumstances. So the other way is the good old-fashioned PVC electrical tape, which also works quite well. Isn't quite as polished in the finished job, but sometimes it's the only way you can get an insulation in over your new solder joint. We're going to do a little bit of work today on one of our plug and play packs that we make in store to send out to you. It's the Kenwood compact 4-channel amplifier plug and play for Toyota Hilux, and we're going to practice some of our soldering techniques on that kit so you can see what methods we use in store and the best way to solder for you at home. Let's go over the parts that you need to get it all done. But first of all, you're going to want some snips so that you can cut your wires to length. Second of all, this is a really handy tool to have. It's a set of wire strippers to easily and correctly strip the wires before soldering. You're definitely going to want some solder, and the two tools we're going to use to solder in different ways is a flame torch for open flame soldering or brazing, and a conventional tipped soldering iron. This is a gas-powered soldering iron which works just as well with electric. We like to use gas in store because it's a bit neater and convenient. You don't have so many cables laying around, and they usually heat up a little bit faster than a electric soldering iron. You want some top-up gas for your gas tools, and things that we'll get into later with insulation is PVC tape for insulating one way, and this fancy stuff is called heat shrink for insulating another way. And then this other tape that we use is a fabric tape, and we use the fabric tape to loom up after we're done insulating. Now we've got all our tools in our workspace ready, we're going to make our first connections. So we'll snip this so that we've got our wires to work with. And first of all, we're going to solder our rear speaker outputs from this amplifier. So we want to take our wire strippers, choose one of the rear speaker wires and strip that back to have a workable solder length. That is now waste, and that's a good workable solder length. We're going to strip the same on the corresponding wire that we need to connect to on our plug and play harness, and then we're going to insulate this one with heat shrink, which is the best way to insulate, but as I mentioned before, it's not always appropriate. Sometimes you can't get the heat shrink in where you need to, or you can't apply heat to that area if you're soldering to a fiddly place inside a car, which is why we try and work on the bench as much as we can and then take our plug and play solution to the car to integrate so that we've got plenty of room to wield our solder tools without risk of damaging the car at all, or dripping solder, or maybe getting some excess heat onto a panel in the car. So once you've stripped back your two wires to be joined, and then apply your relevant amount of heat shrink to cover the joint after we've soldered it, we need to twist those together like so. Tightly wind the wires as together as you can so that there's no excess little filaments off there, and when they're bound nice and tight, the solder will enter that joint very accurately. Let's show you that now, soldering first with our open flame method. Alright, so now we're going to heat this joint and apply solder to it. An important thing I want to point out here, whenever you're soldering a join, is that you don't want to heat the solder and apply the solder to the join. You want to heat the join and then apply the solder to the join. By heating the join itself will melt the solder and then take the solder in. Austin, bring the camera in close. Now, you'll see when we heat this join, then we apply a little bit of solder. The solder gets drawn into the join via a method called capillary action. Once we apply the heat, the solder just gets absorbed into the join, and when you've soldered nicely and consistently, it should be nice and smooth and flat, allowing our heat shrink to pass over the join. We can then heat the heat shrink with our torch to quickly insulate that. And then you have a clean, reliable, professional connection method that cannot fail under any circumstances. And now we've prepped another join, and this time we're going to solder with the conventional soldering iron instead of the open flame. So you might find that using the conventional soldering iron gives you a slightly neater solder join if you can get enough heat nicely into the join, which we'll do in a moment. The advantage of using a conventional soldering iron over the open flame is neater, a little bit more control. However, we find it can be a little bit safer to use the open flame in a lot of circumstances, because when you're using a conventional soldering iron, it's easy to tip, it's easy to knock it out of its stand. That can fall over and damage parts and your work area around you. I have seen technicians many a time burn themselves on these as well, dropping them or fumbling with them. However, with an open flame, we can solder a join quickly, and then as soon as that is off, it's completely injury-free. You can put that down on your job, on the floor of a vehicle. There's no risk of burning your work area or yourself. So these can be a little bit safer and faster. You don't have to wait for them to heat up, but it does take a lot of practice to learn how to solder neatly using the braze method. So we're going to solder now with the conventional tip soldering iron. We've got our solder, we've got our pre-prepped join. Austin, come in close so we can show this. The strategy with this is the same. You need to heat the join, not the solder. So we apply heat to the join, and then we dab in the solder, and that same method, capillary action, draws the solder into the join in between the two wires and joins them very, very thoroughly. Once we've applied our solder to the join, we can then slide over our heat shrink and insulate that with the open flame. And then we have a tight, reliable join that cannot fail in any way. I've now prepped and soldered another join to show the other method of insulating. The other method, other than heat shrink, is to insulate with PVC tape. To insulate a join like this, you only need a small piece of tape, which I've already torn off here. Austin, come in close. So you want to wrap the tape quite tightly around the join. Start at one end with a bit of an angle, moving along the wire. Pull it tight with every lap around the join and finish it off there with a nice twist. That's a suitable method of insulating. It will do the job. You can see how it's not quite as neat as the heat shrink insulation. The heat shrink also can't ever come unraveled or unwrapped and will not slide. The PVC electrical tape, if bound tightly and nice, will also be quite reliable long term, particularly after we finish these and bind them up with the fabric tape, which we'll show you shortly. But the preferred method of insulation, if you can, is always with the heat shrink. Just for double protection, we're going to put the heat shrink over this join, just to be sure. Okay, now we've completed all our soldering to make up this plug-and-play kit for the Kenwood amplifier to Toyota Hilux, Hiace, Corolla, a few other ones. What we need to do now is loom up our loom so that everything's secure and protected and professional. So we've done a little bit of fabric looming here on the input side harness for the amplifier. I'm going to show you now how we loom up the main power and speaker side harness of the amplifier. So using our fabric tape, come on in close, Austin, is what we use to loom. Because it's nice and soft, it's nice and malleable, and it also takes the rattle out of these cables if they're sitting up against any parts, any firm parts inside the dash. It will help reduce rattles, which is why lots of well-built cars, premium Japanese cars and European cars always have this as factory in a lot of their internal looming. So once we've got all our little connections made there, we want to bundle them together neatly and tightly and then loom that up with fabric tape for a full professional finish. And a little bit on this side to bind everything up neat and tidy. By looming that up nice and tight, it double protects our insulated connections that we made earlier, so that they can't possibly come loose or become uninsulated at any time, and then they have no possibility of shorting. We don't have to bind that up all the way, just enough to protect and guide the cables so that they can go the correct direction to the amplifier and remain neat and tidy. So that's now our interface cable. These two plugs will connect to the head unit of the Toyota vehicle. These two will connect to the original harness in the vehicle, and that's giving us a plug-and-play solution for the Kenwood Micro 4-channel amp. This is similar to all of our T-harness, interceptor harness, plug-and-play solutions that we build up with all of our amps: Alpine, Sony, Kenwood, Kicker, the works. And this is what you'll receive in your package from all the website orders that we pump out, and we've got a team on hand making these all week, putting together different bespoke orders for you as you make them from the website. I hope you've enjoyed watching. I hope you learned a little bit about soldering methods, installation methods, and the nice way to bind up a loom professionally before taking it over and installing it to your car. Hopefully this helps you with some of your DIY tricks and processes at home. Get across to the universalfuze.com.au website for a whole bunch of DIY plug-and-play speaker, amplifier and multimeter upgrade packs for all sorts of different cars. Or if you're in Western Australia, duck into any of the Audiocom stores who keep all of that gear in stock, can build this sort of thing up for you, no problem at all, for any application if we don't already have it done. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, stay apprised of all the new tips and tricks